All right, so the ingredients of the model were such that there are both tangible and intangible investments as inputs. They interact in a certain way. They're complements. And we were essentially going to look at two measurement regimes in terms of what's disclosed to outsiders. Right? What's disclosed to outsiders is going to affect the price of the fund, as we saw here via this term. Right? It's going to affect Q1 essentially. So what is the information outsiders can extract from measuring versus not measuring intangibles? If you don't measure intangibles, again, so going back to the structure of the signals or the reports, if you don't measure intangibles, you leave them commingled, then essentially they are part of your income statement here, as you see being subtracted from operating profits. They're also, of course, part of the cash flow reports, right? Being subtracted from cash. So this is your operating profits minus tangible investment minus intangible investments. If you try to measure intangibles, you may actually two kinds of mistakes. So that's key. The first mistake I was describing before lunch was it's difficult to separate operating expenses from intangible investments. That's what I call W. And if you overstate your intangible investment, essentially what would happen is, so this is like the accrual we saw in the earlier model, you're going to overstate earnings, right? Because earnings at the end of the day would be your net cash flows, add back the two accruals, which is the measurement of tangible investments, measurement of intangible investments. So the larger W is, the larger would be your operating profits. And you can see right here, of course, to write this more explicitly, this is x1 minus k minus n plus gamma, adding back k plus eta, which is the measured tangible investments, and then you're adding back your intangible investments, which is n plus gamma plus w minus eta, right? So the eta errors are offsetting, but not the w errors, right? Because if you overstate your intangible investment, your earnings are higher. But of course, so that's the first mistake. The second measurement error you could make is separating what are tangible investments from intangible investments. Call that eta. If you understate your intangible investment, you overstate your tangible investments. Okay? So there are two kinds of mistakes that you make once you try to measure intangible investments. You don't make any mistakes here. There are no measurement errors here, as I mentioned this morning, because you're not really, only thing you're measuring here is actually tangible investments. That's the key. Again, the assumption is you're measuring it precisely here. But don't take this literally, as I said this morning. The way to think about this is, here you actually when in doubt here, you're expensing. Right? You're expensing all. As a result of that, you can think of the disclosure of the tangible investment actually as really saying this. You're actually also understating your tangible investment. You're reporting it as IK. So the inference will be of the market would be that every time they see an I sub K, your tangible investment is at least equal to what they observe. And so you're in a way, this is a very conservative regime in the sense that you're expensing any investment expenditures, and you're also perhaps understating your tangible investments. But for simplicity, we're saying that the errors are so small, so you can think of the report here on the tangible investment as being equal to K. Here, you're very liberal in your measurement, and as a result of that, you're making all sorts of mistakes in separating tangible and intangible investments from cash flows. Right? If you don't measure at all anything, of course, which is a third regime, you could argue, this is what you'll see. Here, you're not measuring anything. All cash flows are commingled with both types of investment expenditures, tangible and intangible. But the expensing regime, you're measuring tangible without intangible, while in the measurement regime, you're measuring everything, right? Tangible and intangible investments. Now you. All right, so here, now, what do we do with this? Here are the questions we're going to ask. Is it always desirable to measure intangible investments? Or should we sometimes leave intangible investments as being commingled with your operating expenses? Right? The practical counterpart of that would be to ask the question, should we try to separate marketing expenditures into that component of marketing expenditures that truly affects the brand name of the company, that affects future cash flows, from marketing expenditures that only affect current revenues, current period profits. Right? That would be like the counterpart of the measurement regime. Or should we leave marketing expenditures always commingled with other expenditures? Right? That's one way of thinking about this. There's another question here you could ask. You can push this model further, which would be, should you put these intangibles on the balance sheet? Right? It's not quite, I think you were asking that earlier, right? Ammon was asking, right, is this the same as capitalizing intangible? And my answer was, well, not quite, because you can think of it that way. Capitalizing in accounting really means putting on the balance sheet. Expensing means putting on the income statement. But we don't even have a good understanding of that, right? Why do we put something on the balance sheet? What are the implications versus putting it on the income statement? For example, R&D right now is recognized on the income statement as an expense, US GAAP at least, right? IFRS, part of it is capitalized development, but US GAAP, everything is expense. What would be the consequences of capitalizing R&D internally for a firm, right? A standalone firm. We don't have good answers to that. We don't know, right? We don't know that. Then we need to model the balance sheet very seriously, which I'm not here, right? Here I'm just saying measure, don't measure. Capitalize when we put on the balance sheet and then perhaps amortize, depreciate. So that would be a different kind of model, right, to think about. And then what would be the consequences of that on the firm's incentive to invest in K versus N and so on. But here it's, in a way, a more primitive question. Should we even separate and measure these intangible expenditures and report them separately, regardless whether it's on the income statement or balance sheet? Right? I'm completely agnostic about, what are the differences from being on the balance sheet, therefore capitalized versus expense. All right, so if you compare these two measurement regimes, before we go and solve the model, let's think about what are the trade-offs. Right? So the trade-off is, as you can see, the market doesn't observe K, the market doesn't observe N. Both K and N are value relevant, right? There'll be when you price the firm up there, you'll need to essentially figure out what are your Ks and what are your Ns. But you don't observe either one of them. At least in the measurement regime, you don't observe the K and the N, because the reports you get on K and N are noisy reports about an action. So going back to what we did this morning, you'll be forced to form conjectures again, which is what we'll do here. So in the measurement regime, you'll be forced to form conjectures about K and N. Once you form these conjectures, we will see that we actually have information. So imagine K hat and N hat. From Z sub C, then you'll have information about X1, given your conjectures about K and N. Right? This is X1 minus K hat minus N hat plus gamma. So Z sub C would provide information about X1, which is important because that would allow you to price the firm, to form beliefs about X2, the top. And also Y sub C, once you give a conjecture, well, without a conjecture here, it gives you information about X1. So in the measurement regime, given your conjectures about K and N, you have two signals, if you will, about X1. Right? Z sub C, Y sub C. And you'll use that to price the firm, and then we'll see what are the consequences of that. In the expensing regime, you actually have very good information about tangible investments. Right? In fact, perfect here. However, you only have, then you'll be forced to form a conjecture about N, right? Because you don't observe it. Yes. You'll be forced to form conjecture about N, because you don't observe it. Therefore, Y sub E would be X1 minus N hat plus gamma. Right? Which means that given your conjecture, you'll have a signal about X1. Right? Of course, Z sub E is going to be redundant because Z sub E is always YE minus K. Which means that, so here's the trade-off. In the expensing regime, you have very good information about tangible investments. And you have one signal about X1 which would allow you to form beliefs about future cash flows. While in the measurement regime, you have crappy information about tangible investment because of the ADA. But you have very good information about X1. You have two signals, which is Z sub C and Y sub C. So that's going to be the trade-off. There's a trade-off, right? There's no this is not a model where you have more information when you measure, because when you measure, you're very liberal in your estimates about tangible and intangible investment in such a way that there is a trade-off between these two regimes. The question for us would be, what are the consequences of this trade-off?
So I still understanding the assumption that the curve is
Yeah, yeah.
because one thing that here's something that if you are in doubt, you basically explain everything. So I feel like there's probably an arrow every time. Yeah, with a positive meaning. And the variance is probably even harder than the calculator because in a American region, at least you're trying to do something to separate the two. But in
Right.
expensing region, if you do nothing, you actually have to do. I still don't understand why.
Yeah, so maybe it's because I didn't explain it well. Let me try again. In the expensing regime, you are not attempting to measure intangibles at all, right? So as a result of that, so think of the expensing regime where you are very conservative in the sense that any kind of investment expenditures, in the intangible nature, you're expensing it. Which is what this is capturing here. Right? This is an expense. Right? You're subtracting it from X1. And I've said that you can also think of it as you're also expensing some tangible investment. That's why every time you should really think of this report as when you see I sub k, a report on tangible investment, what the market is saying is your level of investment in tangible assets is actually at least greater than or equal to I sub k. Because you're also expensing some of this guy, the tangible investments. Right? But for simplicity, think of the error you're making here as not being very large so that you're getting a perfect measurement of the tangible investment. While in this regime here, in measuring your intangible investment, you're making a lot of mistakes in both. And that's what this is capturing. Another way of writing this model is you can write I sub k is equal to k plus some noise, but the variance of this noise here is much lower than the variance of this noise. Huh? Because, again, as I'm saying here, you are very conservative here. You don't want to make mistakes at all. You're very precise. Mostly you're expensing. Right? Mostly you're expensing. So therefore, here you have a lot of flexibility in measuring. You're saying that, I don't care, we just need to measure, however large the mistakes are. So the variance of your noise here would tend to be larger than the variance of your noise. That's all that you need in this model. Right? Here you're doing as good of a job as you can in essentially only capitalizing things you're pretty sure are going to have impact on your future cash flows. For simplicity, we said, well, let's assume you can measure this precisely. Here you don't actually care about type 1, type 2 error, you're just measuring. Here you're very worried about making a type 2 error. You know, that's what you think about it. You say that when in doubt, expense. Therefore, if any report that you get in your tangible investment, even though it might be prone to error, there's not much error compared to this regime right here. There's much more errors in measuring. Right? Another way to think about it is when I'm trying to separate tangible and intangible investment, in this regime right here, here I'm essentially saying that I'm only going to go and focus on the very productive aspect of the tangible investment and recognize this. Here you're saying that, you know what, even if I make mistakes in both, it doesn't really matter as long as I'm measuring my intangible investment. Someone has their hand. Yeah? Did I? I don't think I satisfied you. Keep asking. Okay. At the end of the day, I want a trade-off. Right? You can see where I'm going. I need a trade-off. Because what you're pushing me is you're saying, no, actually, here too, here you should be able to measure K as precisely as here. That's where you're going, right? You're saying, oh, here you should have this. Now what would happen in this world? Tell me yourself. I don't have a trade-off anymore. One regime is always going to dominate the other, right? Which regime would be better? Which one? This one. Here I can measure K, and also I'm getting information about Y sub C. So this regime is always going to dominate this regime. Right? Because this does always better than this, because here I'm actually expensing all the intangibles. Here I'm trying actually to measure the intangible. In fact, if the variance of W is very low, I'm getting precise information about X1. I'm getting precise information about K. So this regime will always dominate this regime. So we wanted to set up the model in such a way of saying that, look, in practice, it is probably true that when you are measuring intangible investments, you're making several kind of errors. One of them is essentially you are making errors in separating intangible investments from operating expenses. You're also probably making measurement errors in separating tangible versus intangible investments. Less likely to do so here, and of course, we're assuming here you're not making any errors in measuring intangible investment. All I'm saying here is you can also write the model in such a way to say that the errors you're making in measuring tangible investment is going to be lower than in the measuring regime. That's all that we do. But we decided to make, writing the paper to say that you're not making any errors in measuring tangible assets. Before I proceed, any other questions? Now these are valid questions, right? You should, again, this is how you write a model, right? You want to write a model to capture the fact that there are instances in practice where you could make mistakes. I truly believe that there are various kind of errors you'll be making in terms of separating intangible from tangible investments. And these are two errors that I've discussed a lot in practice. This one is very obvious, right? We talk about that all the time. Insiders have incentives to camouflage operating expenses as intangible investments. This one is another mistake potentially you could make. Once you start separating tangible versus intangible investments, you also could make mistakes intentionally or unintentionally both. But if you're not measuring intangibles at all, of course, then the mistakes you're making in tangible investment is much lower. For simplicity, you're not making any. We all right? Okay. So given this now, can we generate a trade-off? What is the nature of the trade-off? Well, let's first of all solve for full information. Just again to get a sense of the benchmark. What do we expect in terms of economic efficiency? And then we'll look at the impact of these errors, these measurement errors, in terms of deviation from economic efficiency. Right? So what is the full information word here? P1. So full information. P1, information at date 1 would be K. We observe N. We observe N plus gamma. We observe X1. Everything. Right? Which is, this is just a benchmark that is not ideal. That you'll never reach this. But let's see what happened in this world. Suppose that you could credibly communicate K and N plus gamma X1 to the market at date 1. Remember, because they are realized. And insiders know K and N. N plus gamma can also be credibly dispersed, separately measured. And of course X1, which is the date 1 operating profits of the firm. What would happen in this world? So P then would be Z1, which is X1 minus K minus N plus gamma. That's always realized anyway at date 1. Plus expectation of X2 given phi, which is K comma N. Let's write the whole thing, N plus gamma X1. Right? That's your pricing rule at date 1. Now what is this? This is X1 minus K minus N plus gamma. What is expectation of X2 given K comma N comma X1? Well, this is going to be, we know that X2 and X1 are correlated. So this is the covariance between X2 and X1, which is rho. Is that what it is? Yeah. Over the variance of X1, which is sigma squared, times X1 minus mean of x1, but mean of x1 is k of q comma n times mu. Right, I've just exploited the, oh, and I'm missing here plus the unconditional mean of x2, right, which is plus q of k comma n times mu. That's the pricing rule at date 1. Given that k is observable, n is observable, this is how the market is going to calculate the least of our future operating profits. I've just exploited here. So this is the expectation of x2. Given that you know k and n is q of k comma n times mu plus the covariance of x2 with x1, which is rho, over the variance of x1, which is sigma squared, times x1 minus the mean of x1, which is q of k comma n times mu. That's the pricing rule. At date 0, the firm maximizes expectation of price and chooses k comma n. Why is price a random variable from the perspective of date 0? Because x1 hasn't been realized. And it's right here and right here. Right? So what is this? E of p, maximizing E of p by choosing k comma n, you get q of k comma n times mu minus k minus n plus q of k comma n times mu plus 0, because the expectation of x1 is q of k comma n times mu. So this term drops out, which means that you get 2q of k comma n times mu minus k minus n. Right? So that's in the full information world, or ex ante, this is essentially the expected payout. And this is pretty intuitive. 2 times q of k comma n times mu is the cumulative expected profits, date 1 plus date 2. That's why the 2 pops out. Right? Times q times mu, which is the expected return, minus the investment in the tangible asset, minus the tangible investment, minus the intangible investment. Expected, right? Because the average over the n is n plus gamma, but we have essentially taken the average over the n plus gamma, the average of the mean of gamma 0. Right? From that we can have the first order condition. You get 2q sub k of k comma n times mu is equal to 1. And 2q sub n of k comma n times mu is equal to 1. So these are the first order condition with respect to k. First order condition with respect to n. And we have 2 equations, 2 unknowns, k and n. You can solve for this. Right? It's going to have essentially a unique solution that will pop out of this. You can in fact insert the Douglas technology in here and solve for the optimal tangible and intangible investments, which I won't do for the sake of time. I just essentially, what is if you use the Douglas, let's write it here. And keep it here as a benchmark, and we'll see what happens in the other regime. So your Q of k comma n is k to the power of alpha n to the power of beta, right? That's the Douglas technology. The first order condition, so this is with respect to k again, is 2 mu q sub k comma n is equal to 1. First order condition with respect to n, you get 2 mu q sub n k comma n is equal to 1. And you can call that equation 1, equation 2. If you take 1 divided by 2, you'll get q sub k over q sub n. I'm suppressing the arguments now of q. It's equal to 1, which for the Douglas is equivalent to k over n is equal to alpha over beta. You can verify this. which makes sense because this is telling you that the ratio of inputs, tangible over intangible, should be in the ratio alpha over beta. Right? You should use these inputs in that ratio. The larger alpha is, by the way, the larger will be the level of tangible investment. The larger beta is, the larger the level of intangible investment. Everything else is fixed. So that's essentially how you should optimally combine tangible and intangible investment, right? In this setting, and of course you can now substitute for k, which is equal to alpha over beta times n from in first order condition for k to get essentially an optimal form for k. You should verify this. It's just algebra. And this is the optimal level of investment in 2 mu So these are the full information level of investments, tangible and intangible. Right, again, I'm getting all this essentially from substituting for k is equal to alpha beta n in this equation right here, and then solving for k, and similarly you're getting n. Right? You can verify this. These are benchmark, right? I'm deriving a benchmark which is unattainable in practice, that you can disclose everything. Right? What we were really interested in is what happens if you have the expensing regime versus the measurement regime. What are the distortions to k and n? Right? What are the nature of the distortions? So let's do that. Let's first look at the expensing regime. The insights here will be similar to what we saw in the morning for the expensing regime. So here we go. So expensing regime, you observe k comma y sub e. Right? I'm going to suppress the z sub e because it's redundant. Right? Once you know these two, you can get z sub e by taking y sub e minus k. So that's the information. That's what the market observes. K comma y sub e. The level of tangible investment and the earnings report. Right? The earnings report. Which means that P of k comma y sub e, so that's the price at date 1, it's a function the information observed to outsiders, which is k comma y sub e, is equal to what? Y sub e minus k, because that's the cash flows, that's the net cash flows at date 1, that's z sub e actually, plus the market's beliefs about x2 given y sub e comma k. Right? Risk neutral pricing. Market is pricing the firm based on available information. So this is the cash flows plus beliefs about future operating profits given the information set of the market. Right? K is observable. Now what is y sub e? We know what y sub e is in the expensing regime. It's really this. But however, the problem is n is not observable. So then how is the market going to calculate this conditional expectation when n is not observable? It's going to conjecture. Right? We've seen that. The market is rational. So market does not observe n and is forced to make a conjecture. Now, how is the market going to form a conjecture? Now, in the morning we saw that I called it n hat. But here I'm not going to call it n hat because the market knows that your choice of n depends on your choice of k. They're linked, right? We know that from the insight from the full information because they're complements. The market observes k here. So therefore, the conjecture of the market would form about n would be n of k. Now, of course, you cannot say the market would believe you are choosing n and k in this proportion, because this is the full information. It might turn out to be that case in equilibrium. But of course, we don't know that. So therefore, the market doesn't observe n, is forced to form a conjecture, given that the market observes k, market believes or conjectures n to be a function of k. Right? So your conjecture now has to depend on, your n has to depend on k. It's a function. Right? This conjecture is a function because you know that your choice of n depends on your choice of k. And now you observe k. So therefore, you're going to conjecture. Of course, in equilibrium, we have to verify that indeed the market can form that type of conjecture, n of k. Right? But for now, this is the best that we can do. You observe k. Let's assume that the market forms a conjecture of n, right? That depends on k. So n of k. Now, given this conjecture, the market views YE to be distributed as x1 tilde minus n of k minus gamma. So the market forms the conjecture about this function and then views YE to be x1 tilde minus n of k minus gamma. Now this is well defined, right? It wasn't well defined before when n was unobservable because you don't know how you're going to form. But now, given the conjecture, this has a proper distribution. YE is essentially x1 tilde minus some function minus gamma. Of course, this function in equilibrium, we have to show that the market's conjecture is correct. Right? So YE is x1 tilde minus n of k minus gamma. Now using this now, YE, we're going to essentially calculate. Now we can explicitly calculate this posterior, given the market's conjecture. Right? We can calculate this posterior because YE, x1 tilde is normally distributed, gamma is normally distributed. A combination of normally distributed random variable is going to be normally distributed. So YE is normally distributed, x2 is normally distributed, therefore the conditional distribution of x2 given y is also normal with a certain mean and variance. Right? So we can calculate this, we can flesh this out. So what is this? Let me directly go to the expression for it. So expectation of x2 given ye comma k given n of k. So I'm going to write the conjecture in here now. Is equal to so what is this? Rho over sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared. Sigma squared is what I call, what did I call the sigma x squared? Times ye minus q of k comma n of k times mu plus n of k. Of course, plus q of k comma n of k times mu. Let's see if this makes sense. So this is the conditional mean of x2 given the market's information and the market's conjecture. It's going to be the unconditional mean of x2, which is q of k comma n of k. See that the market's conjecture is embedded here because you don't know n. Times mu plus the covariance of x2 and ye, which is the covariance of x2 with x1, which is rho, over the variance of ye. The variance of ye is sigma x squared plus sigma gamma squared. This is a constant. This is not a random variable. So it's this term times ye minus the mean of ye, which is this term. The mean of ye is q of k comma n of k times mu minus n of k, and the mean of this is gamma. So if I'm subtracting, this became positive. Is that okay? So that's essentially the expectation of x2 given ye, given k, given n of k. Which I can now substitute in the pricing rule, because this is p of ye. So essentially, p of k comma ye is equal to ye minus k plus, I'm going to basically substitute this above, q of k comma n of k times mu plus rho over sigma x squared plus sigma gamma squared times ye minus q of k comma n of k times mu plus n of k. Right, that's the pricing rule in the expensing regime. We can see that it all depends on k and ye, right? Because n is not observable here in the expensing regime, right? Depends on ye, k, right? N of k, mu is common knowledge. All these are constants, right? So this is a well-defined pricing rule. Of course, at date 0 now, the firm will take this pricing rule as given and optimize. Right? So the same things we've done in the morning. I can erase this and use this space. So, from the perspective of date 0, ye tilde is a random variable, right? That's the uncertainty. Therefore, E of p tilde, I'm going to suppress the arguments here, given k comma n, because at date 0, the insider, the manager, is choosing k comma n, right? Taking the pricing rule as given and optimizing. The reason I have a tilde here is because at date 0, ye has not been realized yet. It's a random variable. So I'm calculating the expectation of p. When I'm averaging over p, I'm averaging over values of y sub e, right? Because it hasn't been realized yet. So what is this? So I'm going to basically take the expectation sign above. I'll get q of k comma n for the first term minus k plus q of k comma n of k times mu plus rho over sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared times expectation of ye. So I'm going to carry out the expectation. I'll get q of k comma n times mu plus n, or minus n, and then minus the remaining terms. Right, so key thing to note here is, and we've seen this again before, for this model, is when the manager is averaging over the values of ye, essentially this is times mu here. That's the true end. Right here, the true end. And also right here is the true end. The conjectures are embedded in the other terms, right? In this term right here. So that's E of P. And now we're going to take the first order condition with respect to K and then respect to N. Right? But of course we'll never take the first order condition with respect to, well, we'll take the first order condition with respect to N because of the N being subtracted right here. I missed an N here, right? This should be Q of K comma N times mu minus K minus N. Coming from right here. So the minus N here, and here it is also minus N because this is the expectation of YE. Yeah, so it's minus K minus N here. This one is okay. This one is also fine. Okay. Now, first order condition with respect to let's say do it with n first. What do we get? Q sub, so mu times dq dn. Let me write it this way. K comma n minus 1 plus, this doesn't depend on n, right? Because this is the conjecture, plus rho over sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared times, I come in here, q mu times dq dn, again k comma n minus 1 is equal to 0. That's my first order condition with respect to n. Right? This term. This term doesn't depend on n. It's a conjecture. It depends on k. Neither does this term. So that's my first order condition with respect to n, which actually, you can see, I can factor out the mu dq dn minus 1. It's here and here. This implies, from this immediately, this tells us that mu dq dn k comma n is equal to 1. Let's call that star star, and this is really coming from here, right? I factor it out, so I get mu dq dn minus 1 times a positive term equal to 0. Therefore, this must imply that mu dq dn is equal to 1. Questions? Okay, so that, I call that equation star star because that equation will essentially is a useful equation because recall that in the full information regime, what was the first order condition with respect to n? It was 2 dq dn times mu is equal to 1. Here the 2 disappeared. It's just mu dq dn is equal to 1. It means right away that it's going to be underinvestment in n in this regime, in the expensing regime. Right? It's going to be underinvestment in n in the underinvestment in n relative to tangible investments, right? Because the other one is T2Q. The other one is essentially mu times dq dn. Underinvestment because Q is concave. Right? Which means that you're going to invest less in the tangible, right? So recall that in the full information regime, you get 2 mu dq dn k comma n is equal to 1. Right? This implies that firm will underinvest, and we'll characterize this more explicitly very shortly. But all we can tell right now is firm underinvest in intangible relative to tangible. In the expensing regime. Right? That's one thing that pops out. First of all, why is that? Right? Yeah.
The derivative is going to be at the point where k is also present optimally. It might not be the same than the one we have in both solutions, right?
No, that's true. K is also going to change now, right?
Exactly. So the derivative might not be the same. So there might be conditions in which.
No, but for any given k, the level of n is going to be, if you compare these two equations, this is saying that for any given level of k, the n is going to be lower compared to the full information regime. That's what this is saying.
Yeah,
Given. But we have to derive the optimal and show eventually what happened. I will actually show you that you will overinvest in k compared to n. Because now k has Well, let's get there. I'll show you. Let's crank it out and see what will happen, right? Let's crank it out. So that's the first order condition with respect to n. We still have essentially the first order condition with respect to k that we haven't looked at yet, right? Because we have to also solve for that. So using, so let me see what I can erase here. Let me erase. Let's push this further. Using Q of k comma n equal to k of alpha and sub beta. Now using the cup Douglas, star star becomes mu beta k to the power of alpha n to the power of beta minus 1 is equal to 1. You can verify this. It's easy to verify. And we'll call that triple star. Star, double star, triple star. So using this here, this very specific, you can show that double star here. This essentially is equivalent to that. That's a specific form for this. Now, star, star, star describes a relationship between k and n that can be anticipated by the market. Right? In other words, n of k satisfies star, star, star. Remember we said that the market is going to form a conjecture of what should n be given k? Well, the conjecture is implicit in here. Because essentially n here can be written as a function of k. And essentially again the market can anticipate that because all this condition here can be calculated by the market. You remember we always have to verify the conjecture and show that indeed this is feasible. Well, given the structure of the game here, the market can calculate these, right? Because this is known. dq dn is known, how the derivative is known, mu is known, 1 of course is the number, and you observe k. So from that essentially we show that the market can form essentially the conjecture that we made earlier. So that's one thing. Now what is the first order condition with respect to k now? You have to differentiate this guy with respect to k. U of p, the objective function with respect to k. Again, similarly you can show, and you can follow right, mu dq dk, k comma n, times 1 plus rho over sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared, minus 1, plus mu dq dk, k of n of k, plus dq dn, k of n of k, times n prime of k, times 1 minus rho, sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared, plus rho over sigma gamma squared plus sigma x squared, n prime of k equal to 0. Now this is a bit more painful here because now when I'm taking the derivative with respect to k, I also have to differentiate this with respect to k. Because I know that the market's conjecture is going to change as the level of k is changing. Right? So that's why I have many more terms here. So the first term, q sub k minus 1, is coming from these two terms. So that's this right here. That's the first term. Then I have to go inside and differentiate this dq dk times mu, but then I have dq dn n prime of k. That's what this term is coming from. You can follow that, right? So essentially differentiating this, that's the first order condition with respect to k. Right? Because now as you change k, the market's conjecture about n is going to change, and insiders have to take that into account. So that's the FOC with respect to k. Now in equilibrium, n of k is equal to n. In equilibrium, the market's conjecture has to be correct, equal. It has to be exactly the level of n chosen by the firm. So I'm going to impose this equilibrium requirement. This says that the market's conjecture is correct. And using u dq dn q of k comma n, bringing up space here, and using u dq dn k comma n is equal to 1, the FOC, first order condition for k becomes, it simplifies. Mu dq dk k comma n plus n prime of k is equal to 1. Right, so I've done two things here. Once I derive the first order condition for k, now I'm going to impose the equilibrium requirement that the market's conjecture is correct in equilibrium. So n of k is coincide with the actual choice of k. I substitute that in here, and also I use the first order condition for n, which is mu dq dn is equal to 1. And impose this in here. I get essentially 2 mu dq dk k comma n plus n prime of k is equal to 1. So this thing simplifies. Right? So that's an equilibrium requirement. I'm imposing that the market's conjecture is correct. And once I've done that, I have essentially two equations. So the equilibrium investments are described by mu dq dn k comma n is equal to 1, and 2 mu dq dk k comma n plus n prime of k is equal to 1. Again, I have two equations. I can essentially solve for k and n, right? Because this, I have to substitute for the Cobb-Douglas in here to get more close, but I know n prime of k, because that's coming from star star. I can calculate n prime of k. I can calculate dk, dq, dk. So I have two equations. I can solve for the equilibrium level of k and n. Right? This is a lot of math here, right? So don't worry so much about the math. I want to step back and give the intuition. But that's the part of doing theory. You have to get your hands dirty. That's a fact of life, right? You have to get your hands dirty. So, but the key thing here is, again, you have to go step by step and think through this. I'm just writing a bit fast. But the key thing here, again, is to step back and think about this problem. In the expensing regime, the problem is the market is forced to form a conjecture about n from k, because you don't observe n. So that's the n of k. Taking the conjecture as given, the market is able to price the firm. Market is rational. It's going to price the firm. That's P of k comma ye at the top. And the conjecture is embedded in here. This is essentially where I wrote essentially that given the conjecture, the market views y of e to be distributed as follows. Once this is the case, you can calculate the pricing rule at date 1. And you can see that the pricing rule at date 1 is a function of the information available to the market, which is k and ye. Of course, embedded in here is the conjecture about n from k. Right? So this is the pricing rule. The firm anticipates this price and optimizes, chooses k and n. And essentially, this is what we got here. The firm takes the pricing rule as given and optimizes and choosing the true level of k and n. So E of P tilde given k comma n, max that. That led to the first order condition for n. And you can see that here, the first order condition for n, the choice of manager's choice of n only affects in the first period the x1, because that depends on n. Doesn't affect the conjecture, because that doesn't depend on the true n, and all affected this term right here. Using that, we got double star. right? From here we said, well, it looks like there's going to be underinvestment in intangibles for any given level of K, which we'll come to in a second. Then we went to the first order condition with respect to K, which I differentiated again, this whole thing with respect to K. Here there are many more terms involved because now, as K is changing, the market's inference about N is also changing. So we started getting N prime of K. Right? N prime of K. Then we step back and say, okay, in equilibrium, so this is the first order condition with respect to K. Now I'm going to impose an equilibrium requirement that in equilibrium, the function N of K should coincide with the true choice of N. So I impose that in here, and I also use the fact that mu of dq dn is equal to 1. This simplifies, this first order condition for K, simplifies to an equilibrium requirement, which is this equation right here. Together with the first order condition for N, now I have two equations, and two unknowns, which is K and N. So I can again solve now for K and N by substituting for the Cobb-Douglas function to put some more structure in it, because I can't push this any further. I've already exploited the Cobb-Douglas function here to explicitly describe N in terms of K. Otherwise, I'll be stuck here. Then I'll have to start figuring out what happened, what are the distortions. So now, if I substitute for Q, the Cobb-Douglas function in each one of these, this is the final forms for the, so let me write it here. So using Q of K comma N is equal to K of alpha and of beta, we can show that K sub E over N sub E is equal to 1 plus 1 over 1 minus beta times alpha over beta. Meaning that the optimal choice of tangible investment in the expensing regime over the optimal choice of intangible investment in the expensing regime is the ratio of inputs, tangible to intangible, is given by this equation. Again, that all is coming from these two equations here. Once you substitute for the explicit form for Q, you get this. Yeah?
What's the intuition for why the optimal K and N are not functions of the variance of gamma? I would have thought that...
Variance of gamma.
So it seems like if the variance of gamma is 0, it doesn't affect the optimal K and N, but it doesn't seem intuitive to me.
Well, gamma, first of all, is completely, it's an orthogonal shock to any of the random variables in the model. Right? It's completely independent. The reason that we need gamma is the reason we needed gamma this morning before lunch, because without gamma, look what would happen. If there was no gamma, then YE is equal to x1 minus n of k. Then once the market forms a conjecture about n given k, the market can perfectly calculate x1. And if the market can perfectly calculate x1, then the market will never use essentially what?
Doesn't need to conjecture.
Yeah, it doesn't need to conjecture. Market believes that it can calculate. So the role of gamma is to capture the fact that to make the inferences, don't make the inferences trivial, to make the problem more interesting. But gamma itself has nothing to say. Gamma is orthogonal to all the problems. If there were risk aversion, if the variance and so on depended on, on gamma, then things might change. This is risk neutrality here, right? Prices are risk neutral. We're not even calculating variance anywhere. It's all about, here is the place we're calculating the variance, but essentially that's saying that the more noise there is, the more uncertainty there is in the unproductive component, this is where the gamma is appearing. Right? So the gamma essentially is appearing, is going to appear, so it's not affecting anything here. It just pops out. Yeah, because it's risk neutrality. There's no other reason. If I make gamma correlated with some of the other measurements, then it might essentially play a role. But it's not. It's not affecting anything here. Okay? Does that make sense? So as I was saying, so the ratio of tangible to intangible investment follows this form. Right? Now, how does this compare with alpha over beta? That's the first question we'll ask, right? This is efficient investment. You should mix those two inputs in that ratio. We know here that this is greater than 1. Because beta is between 0 and 1. So this is greater than 1, which means that k sub e over n sub b is greater than alpha over beta. Which means what? Which means that in the expensing regime, you're relying much more on tangible investment versus intangible investment. Right? So that's one aspect. Now let's push this further. What is the optimal level of k and n itself? Right? This is just the ratio, the mix. We can calculate this again. You can derive this and verify this on your own. It's just algebra. K sub e times to the power 1 minus alpha minus beta takes the following form. 1 plus 1 over 1 minus beta to the power 1 minus beta mu alpha to the power 1 minus beta beta to the power beta. Okay, all these coming because of the Cobb-Douglas function. Right? You can derive the optimal level of tangible investment. Takes the following form. And also, the level of investment in intangibles can be derived similarly. That's n sub e to the power 1 minus alpha minus beta is equal to 1 plus 1 over 1 minus beta to the power of alpha mu alpha to the power of alpha beta to the power of 1 minus alpha. Right? So these three equations, this one, and this one, characterize the optimal investments, right, in the expensing regime. And also the ratio. If you take the ratio of these, you'll essentially get this term. That's where I'm getting this. Now we can compare this now with the full information regime. Luckily, they're in the same form, right? Because this is also k to the power of 1 minus alpha minus beta, n to the power of 1 minus alpha minus beta. What can we learn? Well, various things. First of all, you can show that k sub e is going to be less than k star. Did I call it k star over there? Well, let's call it k full information. And n sub e is, well, let me write it this way. Maybe a better way to write it is k sub e is less than k full information. N sub e is less than n full information. And of course, k sub e over n sub e is greater than k full information over n full information, which is equal to alpha over beta. Right? That's what you can deduce from this, if you step back, in terms of the distortions to the investments. Why is that? Why is it we're getting these types of distortions? First of all, there's underinvestment in both tangible and intangible investments, vis-a-vis full information. Second, even the mix is distorted. Right? You seem to be relying much more on tangible investment vis-a-vis intangible investment in the expensing regime than in the full information regime. Right? So, why is that?
It's hidden action.
Yeah, it's hidden action, but give us a bit more. Yeah. Why is it that, first of all, you have underinvestment in both, and second, why do you have, in a way, your overinvestment in K versus N relative to the full information regime?
Because now more incentive to K because the N is a function of K.
N is a function of K. So first of all, N is not observable. Right? N is not observable. When N is not observable, of course, the market is going to form a rational conjecture that N depends on K. Your level of intangible investment depends on your level of tangible investment. Okay? But why is there underinvestment in both? The reason is very similar to what we saw earlier. When N is not observable, the market is going to essentially price the firm based on the conjecture as we saw. And again, the market is relying both on K and YE. Now look at essentially YE. What is YE? The form for YE. Write it here. YE is x1 minus n of k minus gamma. Right? That's YE. Now, the market is going to try to form beliefs about x1 from YE, given the conjecture. Now, The manager knows again ex ante that the covariance of YE and X1 is sigma X squared, coming from this term, which is positive. So the larger the value of YE is, the market will believe that X1 is high, which means that X2 will be high in the future. Given that, the manager again acquires an incentive to cut back on investment, intangible investment, because you want to boost YE. Right? So, because now N has an informational cost. Right? You essentially, by cutting it back, you'll boost YE and therefore tell the market that things in the future are rosy. Which means that you cut back on N. Right? That's why you have underinvestment in N. But then, given that K and N are complements, you also have a reduction in K. Right? They're complements. So if you cut back on N, naturally you'll cut back on K because they're complements. They're mixed, the larger one is the larger of the other. But more interestingly then, why is it that still the ratio is distorted? Shouldn't it still be alpha over beta? The reason the ratio is distorted is, given that N is not observable, the market is going to form an inference about N from K. Therefore now you have an incentive to essentially, you're cutting back on N, but of course, K is providing informational value. Larger K is, they'll believe that N is larger. So as a result of that, your mix, right? Your mix of inputs is also distorted. It's now tilted more towards K than towards N because N is not observable and you're forming beliefs about N from K. And that's why the mix is distorted. Both of them, you're cutting back on both tangible and intangible investments. The first order effect is underinvestment, because it's again arising from the fact that when N is not observable, you want to essentially, there's an informational cost to N embedded in YE. So you cut back on N to boost YE. By cutting back on N, naturally you'll cut back on K because they're complements. The mix is distorted because K depends on N, and therefore as a result, by relying more on K, you essentially would improve the market's inference that N is high. So these are the two distortions in the expensing regime, which reduces welfare when I talk about welfare later on. Right? So the distortion is there's underinvestment in both. Again, this captures the feeling or the argument made by practitioners or firms that when intangibles are not measured, firms don't have an incentive to invest in it. They cut back on it because you're not being appropriately priced. If anything here, the reason in the model is because you're being priced based on YE. Therefore, to essentially tell the market that future cash flows are high, you cut back on N because they can't properly observe N. So same logic as even the Stein model in the morning. There, of course, it was a different type of action. It was a bias, right? It was an action you should not be taking. Here, actually, N is good because it improves the future returns. The problem is when N is not observable, once the market is forced to form a conjecture, the firms is induced, therefore, to cut back on N to boost Y, right? To again portray that future cash flows are very high. But here we see that because K and N are complements, it also distorts K. So both K and N are distorted downwards. Of course, the mix is also suboptimal given the type of inferences that the market is making. So that's the expensing regime. Of course, we have to compare that with what happens in the measurement regime, because we know there's going to be a trade-off. Same thing with the measurement regimes. I'm not going to go into all the details. There it's a bit easier to solve, actually, because given what we did this morning, so let me do it. Let me erase this. The measurement regime. Measurement regime, go to it directly, market anticipates or conjectures K and N, given that they're hidden action, not observable, say K hat and hat. Remember, in this regime, neither K nor N are observable, right? They have the two reports. therefore, the market is forced to conjecture k hat and n hat, and therefore views z sub z to be equal to x1 tilde minus k hat minus n hat minus gamma, and y sub c to be equal to x1 tilde plus w. Right? If you go back and look at your notes, in the measurement regime, there are actually z sub z, y sub z, and then the two reports about each investment. Right? But the two reports about each investment is not going to provide you any additional information once you make the conjecture. So the information is really coming from these two reports. Given the conjecture, these are well defined. Right? ZC is a random variable that provides a noisy signal about x1. And y sub c is a random variable that provides a noisy signal about x1. Which means that the price of the firm at date 1 would be x1 tilde minus k hat minus n hat plus gamma. Sorry. This is the cash flows. There are no conjectures in here. This has been realized already at date 1. Plus expectation of x2 given z sub c, y sub c, and also here I'll write k hat, n hat. This is the market's conjecture. So that's now the pricing rule in the measurement regime. We're forming beliefs about x2 given z sub c, y sub c, k hat, and n hat. Right? Again, note that in this regime you also have to conjecture k because k is not directly observable now. There's the k plus eta. Right? So you're forced to form a conjecture. Now, what the market takes the pricing rule as given. So okay, the manager takes the pricing rule as given and chooses k, comma, n. Now, before we do that, we need to figure out, we have to calculate this posterior now. Right? How does the market calculate this posterior? Well, first of all, note that z sub c, y sub c provide strictly more information than the expensing regime. About x1 tilde, and hence x2 tilde, right? Because in the expensing regime, there was only one signal, one report about x1, which is the y sub e. Here now you have two signals, y sub c, z sub c, and y sub c. So they provide more information about x1. Of course, however, and here's the trade-off, right, we discussed. The expensing regime provides strictly better information about k. The level of tangible investment. So that's the trade-off, right? That's the trade-off. The expensing regime does a very good job at giving you information about tangible investment. But the measurement regime does a very good job at giving you information about future cash flows. And that's going to turn out to be the trade-off once we derive the optimal k and n. So let's do that now. We need to first flesh out this posterior. What is the expectation of x2 given z sub c, y sub c? Of course, taking the conjectures as given. How would the market calculate this? I'm not going to write down this, derive all the coefficients here. You have to trust me. But E of x2 given z sub c, y sub c, and the market's conjectures k hat, n hat, E actually takes the following form. Right, so for simplicity, I'm going to write it directly and give you the coefficients. You can verify this on your own. That's B1 z sub c, expectation of z sub c tilde, plus B2 y sub c, expectation of y sub c tilde. That's the posterior. It's very intuitive. This is the unconditional mean of x2. Plus, how much do I revise my beliefs about x2 after observing two reports, z sub c and y sub c. And B1 and B2 are just the weights, if you will, I put on right? The coefficients on the cash flow report and on the earnings report. And B1 and B2 are constants. You can verify this. I'll give you the expression. Given the parameters here, B1 is rho sigma W squared sigma X squared, W squared sigma gamma squared, and B2 rho sigma gamma squared over sigma X squared, W squared plus sigma gamma squared. Right, these are standard calculations again coming from what I wrote this morning for the normal right? It's a good idea for you guys to try this on your own once to make sure that you get this. Because once you've done it once, you know there's no magic to it, right? It's just algebra. There's nothing to it, right? But you need to know this, right? This is if you're running regressions, this is what you're doing, right? You're essentially figuring out how much do I learn about x2 given this is like your dependent variable. These are your independent variables, right? So these are pretty familiar to us. But that's essentially what's being captured here. So B1 is a constant in the sense that it depends on the parameters of the environment, so is B2. Right? More importantly for us, we'll figure out in a minute the comparative statics, right? We'll see how B1 and B2 change as we change the various parameters in our environment. So that's useful for comparative statics. But let me push this a bit further because I want to derive the optimal K sub C, N sub C in the measurement regime. So what should I erase? Let me erase this. So we're almost there in terms of comparing the two regimes, but I need to derive optimal tangible and intangible investments here. So firm maximizes E of P tilde at day 0 and chooses K and N, right? That's essentially what's going on at day 0. Now, from firm's perspective, expectation of Z sub C is equal to Q of K comma N times mu minus K minus N. And E of Y sub C is equal to Q of K comma N times mu. Right? This is quite straightforward to see once you look at the structure of these signals. Right, here it is. From the firm's perspective, ex ante, when they're averaging over values of Z sub C, it's Q of K comma N times mu, and of course minus K minus N, because they're actually choosing K and N. Expectation of YC is Q of K comma N times mu, right? Averaging over W gets you 0. Same thing here. That's where I got these. Right? So I'm going to substitute for the expectation of Z sub C in here and in here, because you're taking essentially calculating the expected price. So maximizing expectation of P tilde is equivalent to maximizing in choosing K comma N. Equivalent to maximizing the following. Again, you can verify this on your own. You should be able to see this. Plus P2 Q of K comma N times mu minus Q of N hat. That's it. That's the ex ante objective function of the firm, taking the conjectures as given, which are embedded in the pricing rule, and averaging over values of ZC and YC. Now I take the first order condition for K and N, which I won't. I'll just give you the final thing for the sake of time. You can show, verify that essentially you'll get the FOC for K, the simplification, you'll get mu dq dk is equal to 1 plus P1 over 1 plus P1 plus P2. And for the FOC for N, you get mu dq dn, 1 plus P1 over 1 plus P1 plus P2. Taken together, this implies that dq over dk, or essentially substituting for q. So I'll go back to the Douglas function to get some closed form. We get kc over nc is equal to alpha over beta. So that's the first thing. So which means that in the measurement regime, you can show that there is no distortion in the mix of inputs, unlike the expensing regime. We're back to the same mix we use in the full information economy. Right? The reason for this here is quite intuitive, because in the measurement regime, you actually don't observe K and N. You're forced to form conjectures. Because of that, there's no reason why your mix of inputs should be distorted. Here it was distorted because you are inferring N from K. You're relying a lot on K to form beliefs about N. As a result of that, the firm was induced to choose a higher level of K. Right? So that essentially the market believes that N is very high. So there was a distortion in the mix. You were tilted more towards K than N. But here there's no reason that's the case. That's why you end up getting the same mix. But that doesn't mean you are back to the full information economy. We need to calculate the optimal level of investment in K and N. What is KC versus NC compared to K full information and so on. You can also do that. Again, you can verify this. And here are essentially K sub c to the power 1 minus alpha minus beta. You can verify this is the form 1 plus b2 over 1 plus b1 times mu alpha to the power 1 minus beta, beta to the power beta. Again, this is a function of the Douglas. That's why we're getting these very specific form. N sub c 1 minus alpha minus beta is equal to 1 plus b2 over 1 plus b1 times mu alpha to the power of alpha, beta to the power 1 minus alpha. Right? And of course, for completeness, Kc over N sub c is equal to alpha over beta. Right? So that's your optimal level of inputs in the measurement regime. We can compare that with the expensing regime right here. And of course, we can compare that with the full information regime. So what do we see? What can we say here in the measurement regime? Well, you can again show here that the various things. First of all, to compare the full information regime with the measurement regime, look at the form over there, right? You have, look at k to the power 1 minus alpha minus beta, the left board, far left board. It's very similar, except that this is 2, right? In the case of the full information regime. So therefore, how does B2 over 1 plus B1 compare with 1? It's equal to 1, well, we get essentially the full information regime because we know the mix is efficient. Well, you can show that B2 over 1 plus B1, well, we know the form of this. It's these ratios. Here's B1, here's B2. So we can calculate B2 divided by 1 plus B1. You can show that actually this is less than 1. Right? Both of them are less than 1, which means that you have underinvestment in both Kc and Nc. Right? You have underinvestment in both Kc and Nc. The reason you have underinvestment here now is because, essentially, again, for a very similar reason, the more weight you put on, in fact, you can see it very clearly here, the larger P1 is, the higher the level of underinvestment in Nc, and of course in Kc. So what is it about B1 that leads to more underinvestment? While higher B2 is, the lower the level of underinvestment. In fact, B2 over 1 plus B1 tends to 1 as, you can see it here, right? When is B1 tends to, if B1 tends to 0, when does B1 tends to 0? When sigma omega squared or W squared tends to 0, right? Because it's a numerator, and in the denominator here, you would not tend to 0 the denominator because you have sigma x squared, sigma gamma squared. So as sigma W squared tends to 0, B1 tends to 0. Why is that? Right? So this is what we can deduce here. So I'll write it again, right? So B1 tends to 0 as sigma omega squared tends to 0. And what happens to B2? As sigma omega squared tends to 0, what happens to B2? This term essentially goes away. This term goes away. You get rho. Is that right? You get rho over, B2 tends to rho over sigma x squared as sigma omega squared tends to 0. Thank you very much. Why is that? What is sigma W squared? It's the variance, it's the uncertainty in what measurement error? W, right? Which is essentially separating operating investments from intangible investments. So if you're doing a very good job at separating that, which means that as this noise is going to 0, you are going to put more and more weight on the earnings report than on the cash flow report. Because B1 is the weight you're putting on the cash flow report. Right? If essentially sigma omega squared is going to 0, that means that YC is providing a very good signal about X1. Which makes you put more and more weight on the earnings report than on the cash flow report. And why is that good? The same reason it was good this morning. Because putting weight on the earnings report makes you forward-looking. Because more weight you put on the cash flow report, you have this informational cost from investment kicking in. Remember, because Z sub C is, again, x1 minus k minus n. So as a result of that, the firm is induced to cut back on k, cut back on n, to boost Z sub C, because the covariance of Z sub C and x1 is positive. Therefore, insiders again are induced to say, let's cut back on investment to tell the market that the future is rosy. And in doing so, therefore, there is underinvestment in both, right? You're cutting back on both, and that's below. So the more weight you put on Z sub C, the more underinvestment there is. Therefore, the less weight you put on Z sub C, underinvestment is lower. And that's what this is capturing here. So as B2, as P1 goes to 0, that means that B2 is essentially going up, approaching 1 actually, right? Approaching 1. Of course, in the limit, it will approach 1 because then you'll get full information, which is the 2 mu over there, right? So the distortion here in this regime is captured by B2 over 1 plus B1, which again is capturing what we saw this morning in that simple measurement model, the weight you're putting on earnings versus cash flows. The weight that you're putting on earnings versus cash flows. But still there is underinvestment in both, even though the ratio is optimal. Right? Which means that from a welfare perspective now, we don't know whether we're better off with the expensing regime or the measurement regime. Because we saw here too there's underinvestment in K and N, but there is of course much more underinvestment. N is really distorted downwards. That's dragging down K. The question then is which regime dominates? To evaluate that, we can calculate essentially the expected welfare. This is only one firm here, but you can look at the expected value of the firm ex ante, right? And we know that the expected value of firm ex ante is always given by ex ante value of the firm is 2 mu q of k comma n minus k minus n. Regardless of the regime you are in, ex ante, once you've substituted for the equilibrium K and N, this is how you evaluate the expected cash flows of the firm. This we know where this is coming from. This is the expected cumulative returns. This is the cost investment in the tangible assets, tangible investment minus intangible investment. We can evaluate this, let's call this V. V sub E then, in the expensing regime, we can essentially plug in, right, the optimal level of tangible and intangible investments minus K sub E minus N sub E. We can also compare that with V sub C, the measurement regime. And of course, V star with the full information we already know is Q K full information. Let me write with the subscript. Minus K full information minus N full information. Right? So you can calculate these. These are ex ante payoffs of the firm, welfare of the firm, social surplus, if you will, or surplus of the firm, taking into account the optimal investments. And now we have to compare these. Now we already know, you can show this easily, that V full information is greater than, or VE, and V full information is greater than VC. Right? That's essentially what maximizes social surplus, right? Because there are no distortions. You're maximizing terminal cash flows, there's no distortion. The question for us would be, when is VE? How does VE compare to VC? Right? How does the welfare or the surplus in the expensing regime compare with the surplus in the measurement regime? Again, this is something you can calculate. So, how does the expected payoff of the current shareholders or the expected ex-ante surplus of the firm in the expensing regime compare with V sub C? That's ambiguous. There's a trade-off here. Right? Now again, you can calculate this. So I'll give you the expression. If you plug in the Cobb-Douglas function in here, the optimal choice of K and N. Here is the final expression. I'm more interested in the, not in the final expression per se, but getting a sense of the trade-offs. But let me write the final expression. You can show, using the Cobb-Douglas function, that the expected surplus of the firm takes the following form. Multiply by, this is the long expression, 1 plus 1 over 1 minus beta, alpha to power 1 minus alpha minus beta, half to the power 1 over 1 minus alpha minus beta. It looks nasty, it's not that bad. It's my handwriting that's bad. Right? This is essentially straightforward. You just plug in the Cobb-Douglas function and substitute for the optimal K and N. And when you use Mathematica, if you want to simplify it, you'll get this expression. And again, this is essentially using the Cobb-Douglas. You can also show for the measurement regime that I call the C regime, the ex-ante surplus of the firm. It has a similar form, of course. 2 mu, alpha to the power alpha, beta to the power beta. So the first coefficient is the same, 1 over 1 minus alpha minus beta. 2 over cap t, and I'll tell you what the t is in a second, minus alpha minus beta. T over 2, 1 over 1 minus alpha minus beta. That's it. Now what is t, cap t? Cap t is 1 plus b2 over 1 plus b1 that we derived earlier in the measurement regime. Remember that was the coefficient popping out in the optimal tangible and intangible investment. That's the same thing. I'm calling it big T here. And T lies between 1 and 2. You can also verify that, right? The smallest value of T is 1. When this is 0, the highest attainable value of T is 2. When essentially B1 is 0 and B2 is tending to 1. Which imply that you'll get full information, right? Otherwise, T lies between 1 and 2. Okay? So in other words, now we have to compare VE by VC or derive a condition that shows that under what conditions would the expensing regime dominate the measurement regime. Under what conditions would you not want to measure intangibles at all? Leave it commingled completely with operating expenses. And under what conditions would you like to try to measure it and disclose it separately from operating expenses? Right? That's essentially what the trade-off is, right? What those conditions should capture that. You won't be surprised. And so here are the conditions. Again, the way we do this in the paper is as follows. So what is the paper, by the way? This is the paper in Zhou, an old paper in 2004. I'll send you all the papers that I'm discussing in order. Or Jeremy will typeset them for you. Right? So you'll have all the papers and also the notes. The way we do it in the paper is we derive several conditions that shows you when you prefer measurement and no measurement. And here are the conditions. So keep alpha plus beta, which is strictly, keep it fixed at some r, which is, of course, we know this is less than 1 because this is the assumption of concavity that I started with today, the calculus function. But let's say that alpha plus beta is kept fixed. Of course, you can vary alpha, increase alpha, you have to reduce beta, such that the sum is kept fixed. Right? So we're fixed r. And of course, we know T is defined as follows, which is 1 over 1 plus B2 over 1 plus B1. And this is again between 1 and 2, as I've said earlier. So, you can show that for a given T, fixing a T between 1 and 2, B sub E, C is greater than B sub E for beta large enough. Right? But beta large enough means beta greater than or equal to some beta star of T. Right? You can derive that cutoff. Right? So that's one condition. Now what does this mean? Right? This is a mathematical result. This is saying that if beta is very large, greater than the cutoff, that means that in your production technology, the importance of intangibles vis-a-vis tangible is very high. Right? Because remember, we're keeping alpha plus beta fixed at some r. So if intangibles are very important in your business model, in your technology, then you should measure and disclose it because your expected payoff under measurement is larger than the expense. Right? Again, keeping T fixed. Keep taking the measurement errors as given. Right? So that's one result. Similarly, you can show for a given beta, V sub C is greater than V sub E for T large enough. Right? Or T greater than some T star star of beta. Keeping beta fixed, if T is very large, you should also measure intangibles. Now why? What is cap T being large means? If T is very large, that means that you are gravitating towards 2, which means that B2 over 1 to B1 is getting closer to 1. Which means that you're measuring more reliably. Right? We saw that earlier. If you can measure intangibles with sufficient precision, quite reliably, then you should actually measure it and disclose. Right? These results are not surprising, but at the same time it's consistent with what the FASB is talking about all the time, which is that measure an asset or measure and disclose something separately from other types of investment as long as that asset is relevant enough, captured by high beta, and it's sufficiently reliable. The measurement is sufficiently reliable. This is what the insight from this is. Right? The idea being that if beta is large enough and or T is large enough, measure and disclose intangibles. In all other cases, don't measure it. Which means that if T is sufficiently low or beta is sufficiently low, don't even measure it. Right? That's the insight, which is essentially the insight you'll get again from a real effects model that is very difficult to generate if you did not endogenize these choices of investments, right? Without that, you have no sense about how these investments will change, how economic efficiency will change. The only way you can do that is if you model the change. As you change measurement, how does K&N change? In turn, how does that affect the expected, the social surplus of the firm ex ante? Right? Again, this is a representative firm. We don't have many firms in this model. Right? The idea here is that here's a representative firm choosing K&N. Under what circumstances should you actually measure and disclose its investment in intangibles? Well, it's telling you that when beta is sufficiently large, if essentially intangible investment forms is an important factor in the business model. Compared to tangible investment, measure and disclose it. And also if the measurement is sufficiently reliable. You should measure. In all the cases, you should not. So that's essentially the gist of the model. I know there's a lot of algebra here and so on, but you had to see essentially, I wanted to show you essentially how to lay out the model and look at the various trade-offs you have to make in different. Now this model is a starting point. If you're interested in this kind of, I view this as very accounting. Maybe I'm a bit biased because I wrote this paper. But take that aside, I view this as a very accounting question. There's a lot more to be done here. This is a baby step, this paper. Small, a baby step. There's a lot more to be done here because essentially you're saying that when should we as accountants measure and disclose things? Remember some of you asking me about the balance sheet. We haven't even modeled the balance sheet here. So you have to start thinking about what is a balance sheet? What is the information from a balance sheet? What kind of information do you get if you capitalize and put something on the balance sheet? Well, there is one. If you capitalize something, then you have to amortize it or depreciate it. That's additional information that I'm not capturing here in my very simple model, right? So I encourage you guys to think about these issues, right? What is it about the balance sheet that makes it special, right? Why is that the fact that capitalization is so important? You could disclose it separately, like we are doing here. That should be sufficient, but no. There's also this idea that we should capitalize it, put it on the balance sheet. Can we use a rational model to explain that? Right? We haven't done that. So there's a lot of scope here in my mind for pushing this kind of thinking. Right? But to do that again, you have to essentially sit down and think about what is the information that you'll get from putting it on the balance sheet versus putting it on the income statement. We are not doing this here. Here, all I'm doing here is essentially saying, measure it or don't measure it. And immediately we already see there are consequences, right? Relevance versus reliability are kicking in. So there's a lot of scope here. So I encourage you to take a look at the paper and when you get the notes and so on. And I think there's a lot of scope here in terms of addressing some interesting questions. I'm not saying this model per se, but I think essentially at the starting point thinking about these issues. The model itself is quite simple. The idea is that the insiders are maximizing prices. Right? It's just that some information cannot be credibly disclosed, and as a result of that, outsiders are forced to form inferences about what they see. And in forced to form inferences, the firm's behavior ex ante is such that, given these inferences, the firm is tempted to cut back on investment or choose investment in such a way to influence, essentially influence these reports. And as a result of that, there are distortions, right, from full information. Questions? Yes?
So just as a possible extension to this
Yeah.
framework, can you achieve closer to the full information set by making the manager's incentive not tied to stock price today, but to stock price tomorrow or to
Yeah.
earnings tomorrow?
I had rational expectations about this question, actually. It's a very good question. I actually get that question many times I present some of my work. Someone could say that, hey, why don't you get the manager to focus on terminal cash flows? Right? Because in all the models I've showed you today, starting with Stein and the generic model, what was the objective function? Maximize price. Then you could argue that, oh, that's the problem. You're maximizing price, maximize terminal cash flows. If you maximize terminal cash flows in all these models, you would actually derive what you're saying. You get very close to first best. Or if not, you'll get first best. But remember, I started the generic model today by making two assumptions. One of them is there's information asymmetry, and the second one is insiders care about, they face market pressure, or they care about how they are priced in the market. Of course, your question is very valid. Why don't you just maximize terminal cash flows? First of all, you insiders out there in practice, can we write a contract? So let's go to the contracting world, which is completely missing here. Can we write a contract whereby you essentially induce the manager to maximize prices? The answer is, of course, you could. But remember here, in my model, I never said that essentially the manager wants to maximize price. I'm just saying that perhaps the shareholders care about prices. Then the manager is doing the best that he or she can for the shareholders. Then essentially if you say, no, don't do that, write a contract and terminal, then the shareholders would not want a contract like this. Right? They will renegotiate the contract and say, no, I want you to maximize prices, because that's what we care about. Maybe the more fundamental question is, why are shareholders perhaps that care about prices? Why can we make them think more long term and care about it? But again, I would feel that there is no firm out there where you can get shareholders to care about terminal cash flows. You can get them to take a longer view about the firm, but they always want to maximize shareholder value, right? Whether today, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Right? So it's very difficult to think of a world, in my mind, okay, where you are maximizing terminal cash flows directly. I think to me, you are maximizing short-term or long-term value, but at the end of the day, you're maximizing prices, and prices depends on, essentially your beliefs about terminal cash flows. Right? So there's a very interesting paper in RFS, I'll come to you in a second, Mario, which actually addresses this question. So there's a paper by Diamond and Dybvig, right? So not the Diamond guy who's at Chicago, but the Dybvig guy who's at WashU, Phil Dybvig. He's a finance guy. He wrote a paper with another guy called Zender, I think it's in RFS. And he said that all these models where managers are maximizing prices are crap. You can write a contract on terminal cash flows, and all these signaling models where they show you like Miller and Rock and many papers, all these problems will go away. Because you can always write a contract and terminal cash flows and there's no distortion. Right? So he wrote this paper. The paper became controversial, since like, wow, all these models that uses prices in their objective function maybe doesn't make any sense. Because you get these types of distortions. And they said that you can always write a contract to get the insiders to basically focus on, terminal returns. But then there's another paper, in response to that paper, and that paper is actually quite interesting, which is by John Pearsons, Persons, who shows that actually no, if shareholders were to write a contract like this on terminal cash flows, they would be willing to renegotiate it to get you to focus on prices. So in other words, any contract that focuses on terminal cash flows is not renegotiation proof. It will be renegotiated such that shareholders would want you to maximize prices. Right? So there does not exist a contract that would not be renegotiated if you write a contract in terminal cash flows, it would always renegotiate it, so you're back in the world where you want to maximize prices. Okay? It's a very simple paper that I encourage you also to look at. I'll send you the references exposed after today. But it goes back to that. So in other words, maximizing prices is something that, here in this model, that's what shareholders want to do. Right? They care about prices, and that's the assumption I'm making. And the manager, he or she's doing the best that he or she can for the shareholders. So they would not want a contract like this on terminal cash flows. But more importantly, I also believe that maximizing terminal cash flows does not exist in practice. Firms are essentially going concerns, as we say. Right? They're going concerns, you care about how they are valued. The path of prices is, in my mind, what should be the objective function. To me, that seems more realistic. Yeah?
I was thinking the future cash flows are infinite anyway, and everybody dies. So even if, as an investor, even if I care about future cash flow, at some point I need a technology to transform the infinite
into some price
because I know I'm going to die, so
that's right.
the only way to do that is to have the price integrating the beliefs.
That's right, that's right. So even if you, yeah, exactly. So that's essentially the idea that at the end of the day, you want to, at the end of the day, you end up looking at prices, right? Because terminal cash flows are all reflected in prices. What are long-term prices, right? But look at the compensation contracts out there. How do they look? 5-year contracts, 10-year contracts. On what? They're based on prices. Even long-term contracts are based on price. Of course, there is now, what do you call that? Clawbacks. So you could argue that clawbacks good, but again, these are based on prices. Nobody's looking at terminal cash flows, right? It's very easy to essentially say that we care about terminal cash flows. At the end of the day, you're caring about prices. And prices depends on beliefs about fundamentals. Beliefs about fundamentals depends on information in the economy. And information in the economy depends on accounting.